as it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Each valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth, and all the flesh shall see the salvation of God. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. It wasn't this last week, it was the week before, but my wife and I took advantage of the opportunity to come up to Salado and catch the opening Christmas parade of the Salado Stroll. If you've not been, I recommend it. We walked up and down Main Street in Salado, went into not as many shops as we could, but quite a few. We stopped at the brewery. We did the ghost tour afterwards. We like ghost tours. They're a nice way to learn history, whether or not you want to believe in ghosts. They're fun stories to tell, and you walk around the place and you get a little better feeling. It was a lot of fun. But the parade, the Christmas parade, it kicks off the Christmas season. The gathering gloom, and sure enough, a police car with a siren, and the lights flashing, and the marching bands, high school and junior high, the cheerleaders and the pom-pom squads, and probably, I won't say every merchant in town, but at least, for sure, every real estate agent in town had a float or a pickup truck or an old car that had been restored, and they were filled with folks who were waving and I remember there was a gymnastics class and a dance class that came along, and there were some folks from the base, and then as we got toward the end of the parade, you know what's coming at the end of the parade, right? More sirens, more flashing lights, a big fire truck, and on top of the fire truck, there in the place of honor, was Santa Claus. It was a great Christmas parade, and we thoroughly loved it. It's on our list to go to again next year. And that's how Christmas parades are supposed to be. We weren't able this year to watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade on TV, but we taped it and watched it late. Because after all, what's Thanksgiving without a big Thanksgiving Day parade? And you know what comes at the end of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade? Santa Claus. Surely you remember Miracle on 34th Street. I mention all this because as much fun as it was, and as exciting as it is to the merchants in Salado, and by the way, we went up real early. This whole thing started at 6, and I think we got to Salado about 2:30. And we walked around town, and we talked to the merchants, and went in jewelry stores, and talked with people, and had dinner up there before the whole thing, and met some folks later at the brewery, and had a chance to talk with them. It was a wonderful experience, but the merchants were all excited, because after all, this is when they're really going to make it or break it for the year. They've got to sell their merchandise. So we bought some things. Now, some of you may know that Franklin Roosevelt moved the date of Thanksgiving from the last Thursday of November to the 4th Thursday in November, just because it was the Depression years, and he wanted to help the merchants and give them a little bit of extra time to sell their stuff, And so he moved Thanksgiving up 1 week just so merchants had more time to sell their stuff. Commercialism in Christmas is nothing new. I mention all this because I want you to think about parades and how excited we are when a parade comes. For those of us who have gained a few years, we've seen a couple parades in our time, and maybe we just aren't as excited as we used to be. But I remember those kids in Salado hoping and waiting, and as some of the floats and the wagon beds went by and folks tossing candy to the kids on the street, they were pretty excited about that parade. And whether or not you think you need a whole full-fledged Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, or whether you can just be happy with Salados, there's still something fun and special about a parade, isn't there? Doesn't it just call to the little kid in you? Don't you just want to march with them? We had a blast. Now, if we had a blast, let's go back to the time of Jesus. John the Baptizer comes out and he says, I need to remind you about the parade that God has promised you. It is coming. You've been waiting for it. What parade had God promised his people? Well, 600 years before John the Baptizer shows up. The people of Israel are just about at their lowest point ever. It's not quite as bad as slavery in Egypt, but it is the depths of the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonians were the bad guys on the block. They had invaded Israel. They had conquered the Jewish people. And the Babylonians were smart folks. They realized that as soon as they and their army left, the Israeli people would probably start having dreams of independence, of resistance, of we don't have to do what those Babylonian folks told us to do. So the Babylonians, I admire their political statecraft, even if I don't agree with it. They simply said, we are going to take the lawyers, the engineers, the scholars, the chief priests, the Indian chiefs, all the important people of this community, and they're coming with us to Babylonia. If you're poor, if you're stupid, if you can't make your life work right, you're welcome to stay. But if you've made a success of things in life, guess where you now live? With us in Babylonia. And so the Babylonian captivity begins. The leadership of Israel is carted off to the great city of Babylon, where the Babylonians have tremendous religious festivals in praise of the Babylonian gods. And the Babylonians, the high point of their religious year, is the great kingly parade. At one end of the giant city of Babylonia is the temple. And at the other end of the giant city of Babylonia is the king's palace. And after a whole day of feasting and preparation and getting ready, there is a parade that the Babylonians like to have. And they tell all their captive peoples, guess what? You're turning out for the parade. You're going to line the streets and watch as our armies come by and as our cheerleaders come by. I don't know if they had real estate agents, but I'll bet that if they did, they were in the parade too. And then at the height of the parade, on the fire truck, or whatever their version of it was, came the Babylonian king from the palace right down through this giant boulevard of a highway that they had that ran right through the middle of their capital city. From the king's palace through the middle of the city, past all the Jewish people. And by the way, don't you just know that after having sent the cheerleaders and the army and the marching bands and the real estate agents and the floats and the whoever else he needed to have in that parade, as the king went by, don't you know that he was going, I conquered your country. And the Jewish people just took it because there's nothing they can do about it. And he went off to the temple at the other end of the city where they had a giant religious holiday and a religious service where the king ascended up the steps of the temple and was symbolically re-crowned king, re-anointed, and proclaimed King of Kings and Lord of Lords and ruler of the earth. And the Jewish people who know better can't say a thing. In that setting, the prophet Isaiah says to the Jewish people, you think this is an impressive parade? Let me tell you about a parade that is going to come. It is going to start not at the king's palace and run across the city of Babylonia. It's going to start in the city of Babylonia, go right through the deserts. How does a parade go through the deserts? How do you make it through valleys? God will knock dirt and the tops of mountains down into the valleys and make them flat. So you don't have to worry about going up and down and across. The desert itself will be turned into a superhighway. You think the interstate system here is kind of cool? You think what they're going to do to I-35 someday is going to be nice? What God has in mind puts that to shame. It's going to start at Babylonia. It's going to run across the desert. Every low place will be filled in. Every mountain will be laid low. Every valley will be filled. He's talking about how you construct a highway, right? And it will lead right to the holy city of Jerusalem. And God will restore the fortunes of his people. God will bring the Jewish people back. You will not be slaves. You will not be captives. You will not have to stand on the side and watch the parade go by. You're going to be the marching band and the cheerleaders. And God himself will be at the front of the parade leading the way. And God himself, don't expect this to make logical sense now. It's God. God can do these things. God will be at the front of the parade leading, and God will be on the fire truck at the end of the parade as the king to be enthroned in the real temple in Jerusalem. God will lead his people back from their captivity. God will restore the nation of Israel. And of course, it happened. Okay, it happened without the parade. But the Babylonian captivity came to an end. And the people were let go. Now, I have to tell you, there were some Jewish people who had moved to Babylonia, and they had contacted some of those real estate agents, and they had bought homes, and they had settled down, and they made a nice, happy life in Babylonia. There were Jewish people who stayed in Babylonia. Life was okay for them. And for hundreds of years afterwards, actually, right up until the first Gulf War under President Bush, there was a pretty good Jewish population in that part of the world that had still stuck around from that time. But for those Jewish people who held on tight to the promises of God, for those Jewish people who knew that there was a parade that was going to transform the world, they were eager to get back to Jerusalem. They were longing to get back home. They had stories of how wonderful it was. They remember the promises of what God would do with his people in that city. They made it back to Jerusalem without a parade, But they got to the holy city. Now, unfortunately, by the time they got there, Jerusalem was a bit of a dump. It needed to be rebuilt. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell stories of them rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls of the city. But even then, the Jewish people knew this is not all that God had in mind to just bring us back to the city. God was going to transform things. God was going to change the hearts of God's people. God was going to make the world a beautiful, wonderful, loving, forgiving place. It was going to be like Christmas every day. Has it happened yet? No. And so when John the Baptizer comes, he reminds people there is yet this promise. There is a parade that is going to come. And it will start with God at the front and end with God at the end. And it will start in a way that you'll never see coming. Not with sirens and flashings, but with judgment. And then end in giant celebrations. This, folks, is the message of Christmas. We are still waiting. We are still sure that it is happening. The parade is gathering even as we speak. We ring bells. We sing songs. Do you ever wonder why Episcopal churches often start with a procession? We're trying to remind you of that parade that is yet to come. That parade to which you have been invited, not just to be spectators, but to be participants. A parade through life where our hearts are changed. Where the true meaning of Christmas, you know, the true meaning of Christmas, life is not about what you get, but about what you give. Where the true meaning of Christmas is celebrated every day. Isn't it wonderful that this is the scripture lesson today on a Feed My Sheep Sunday? Where right after church, we can form a parade and go right across to the Great Hall and assemble sack lunches to take down to the Feed My Sheep Center, where our hearts will live out the true meaning of Christmas. It's not about what we get, but about what we give. It's wonderful that we have this opportunity to start the parade and to recognize that next week the parade continues, and next week and next week and next week, and it is a parade of righteousness and a parade of joy and a parade of salvation. You know, it's a lot like the Christmas parade in Salado every day.